Wagner fans are very opinionated. It is 1976, the centennial of the premiere of Wagner's monumental Ring Cycle. The production, mounted in Bayreuth, Germany, as it had been for the last 100 years, was directed by Patrice Chéreau and conducted by Pierre Boulez. Chéreau had only dabbled in opera before, and was known for film work. His Ring Cycle, through scenic designer Richard Peduzzi and costume designer Jacques Schmidt, took the usual ageless landscape of mythic Germany and transformed it into the 19th and 20th centuries. He took the Rhine maidens, typically mermaid-like water nymphs, and turned them into prostitutes, and Wotan and the gods became the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, the 1%, if you will. And it wasn't just set in the aesthetics of the 1800s. Plenty of other pieces of various eras seem placed here. It's the arrival of postmodernism to operatic theater. During Siegfried's funeral march, a crowd of people dressed as lower-class workers gathers to stare at the audience. In the end, the mortals watch the burning of Valhalla, alongside a backdrop that is unmistakably a tenement building. Perhaps a slum from any time in the Industrial Revolution era. They, once more, turn to the audience in silence. This is a recording of what immediately followed. Among the rapturous applause, there was also a large amount of booing. This doesn't seem odd today, and it has never been strange at a Wagner concert for people to be vocal in their displeasure at the representation of the work. However, at the 1976 production, the controversy escalated into a riot. The orchestra revolted against what they sensed was Boulez's lack of knowledge of the work. When his interpretation favored the suppression of leitmotifs, 3/4 of the players publicly disavowed the conductor and refused to appear with him at the conclusion of the first performance. Meanwhile, in the audience, bloody fights broke out between supporters and critics. Wolfgang Wagner's wife had her dress ripped, and another woman had her earring torn off, and the earlobe with it. Traveling to Bayreuth was no easy task then. The wait list for just being able to buy a ticket could last 10 years. People had to faithfully check on their status in the list to ensure they were kept in the queue at all. Even then, not many could afford it. Thankfully, in recent years, ticket buying for Bayreuth has become a first-come, first-serve affair, giving more kinds of people a chance to enjoy the festival than before. But to make it to the Bayreuth Festival, to see Wagner's Ring, is an achievement in itself not easily matched in the art world. At Bayreuth, one does not know what the production will look like ahead of time. That's supposed to be part of the excitement. As clever as it is, when those actors playing the proletariat, for lack of a better term, face the audience in a kind of blanket implication, I can wholly understand the outrage that ensued. Taking such liberties with the stage direction was only the beginning of what would become known as Regietheater, or Director's Theater. Wagner was now the vehicle for any and all outlandish staging. And yet it certainly was not the first time that staging had caused furious controversy. In the 1930s, Bayreuth was transformed into the cultural center of Nazi Germany. Many of these productions relied heavily upon traditional German landscapes and design. Though some are beautiful, they remained more or less the same. This closeness and association to Hitler was poison to the Wagners, and it didn't help that Winifred Wagner made no bones about her affection for Adolf. After the war, in 1951, a drastic move was made to push away from that disreputable past. The push took things so far from tradition that it entered the realm of abstraction. It didn't represent much, and so couldn't be accused as offensive. However, these sets were impressive and grand in their own ways. The removal of the past at the 1956 Bayreuth production of The Master Singers of Nuremberg incited the first boos ever at the festival. The new Bayreuth was radical and controversial, but in a different way from the Regietheater era, whereas it was more about going for a clean slate than deconstructing or transgressing. And that's the real problem with many of these later productions, which are ridiculous in their juxtaposition of as much unrelated stage dressings as they dare. It is done with vindictiveness and spite towards Wagner and his musical legacy, though the vitriol against his personal legacy may indeed be justified. As spotty as that legacy may be, these productions scream with some unfortunate and unenviable personal quandary that tries to distract from the greatness of Wagner's music. In a way, these productions, and others like it, express a lack of sincerity. For example, the most abused of Wagner's operas, Parsifal, has gone through a very ugly series of productions that mock and deface what it represents. This opera has some of the most beautiful and spiritual music ever written, and contemporary productions cannot escape this, even when they try to obscure it with what amounts to an aesthetic middle finger. Stagings like this are not just repugnant and ugly, but downright juvenile and bitter. Nothing being made in the art world approaches this music, and yet instead of striving to reach that level and complement it, all they do is vandalize it. There's nothing wrong with having giant, near-abstract sets, or with playing around with the time period and the setting of the story. What I think needs to be pushed back against are these kinds of arbitrary designs which tenuously serve the agenda of the director, rather than the story Wagner wrote. When you really evaluate the genius and complexity of the libretto and the compositions, this kind of disrespect is unacceptable. But it's still an enduring trend. At Bayreuth in 2017, the director Frank Castorf unleashed a ring cycle that was a new low for Wagner productions, with its embarrassing sexuality and, you guessed it, postmodern mishmash of design elements. Some people attending the festival that year, feeling understandably cheated by the offensive sets and direction, took to wearing blindfolds so as to enjoy just the music. Wagner fans are very opinionated.
I love Wagner. I'm afraid of what they're going to do with it, though.
What this boils down to is that all the ideas that the directors are heaping on these operas ultimately amount to enormous soapboxes. It's debated as to what messages Wagner put into his operas, but he did so underneath timeless stories. These productions, and those for other composers, are now seemingly judged on how daring or subversive they are. The problem is, when you consider the minute number of intellectuals who actually care, why does it matter? Well, it doesn't. However, it isn't just the ideological elements being shoehorned in, and if there's one thing I can't stand, it's aesthetic ideologues. They're almost as bad as political ones. Sometimes the designs of the sets themselves can be over-intellectualized to the detriment of all else save the music, perhaps. The 2012 ring cycle done by the Metropolitan Opera forced the actors to cope with a massive contraption. This segmented set was designed to connect it to the glaciers of Iceland, origin of the myths the ring cycle is based on, or something.
I went to Iceland, digging into the Icelandic roots, tectonic sets, breaking apart and separated in suits the Scandinavian myths.
But if he hadn't mentioned that, how would anyone know or care? Because of how monolithic it is, and I know that was the intent, it steals the show. A monolithic set can still work. In this production of Tristan und Isolde, these sets were lit in a way that they did not consume the actors. However, at the premiere of the 2012 Met Ring, you had a set which did everything from metamorphose to display somewhat uninspired CG visuals. But then certain things like this happened. Deborah Voigt, in the role of Brunhilde, fell off the set during her first entrance as this iconic character. It's things like this that make me somewhat hostile to the idea of Regietheater, where everything must be subjugated to the wiles of the director, no matter how impractical. I find it funny that in a later performance, Voigt makes it up the incline with some effort and seems very relieved to have done so. This ring was an interesting experiment, though the staging resembled cold, brutalist architecture more than anything in Wagner's lively universe of rivers and forests. But Wagner's dream was not fulfilled. If the multimedia aspect was so important, then why not just make a film? If Wagner's dream is so important, and if the stage literally cannot fulfill that dream, then make a film. There have been attempts. You might even be able to cut together various films to approximate the ring cycle. There's Fritz Lang's Der Nibelungen, a notable condensed stop-motion version from New Zealand, and a hand-drawn pilot directed by Alex Alice. Lord of the Rings itself owes more than a little to the ring cycle. There was even an actual filmic adaptation of Das Rheingold, although the latter seemed afraid to truly break completely out of the dimensions of the theater. Wagner's operas can now be seen by many more people than ever, and when a time comes when more opera productions are possible, this is not the kind of crap we need. If you really want Wagner's operas to flourish, then restore what made them great works of art in the first place, where the music is complemented by the production and vice versa. It's part of the original idea Wagner had of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. I believe that if Wagner had worked several decades later, in the 20th century, he would have been making films. That sounds like a good idea, but for the love of God, don't let it look like this. Did I mention Wagner fans are very opinionated?